Yeah, Chalino Sanchez first was introduced into my life uh, rising out of a murder case in which he was the intended victim of a shooting while he was performing on stage in Coachella. I was a homicide prosecutor with the county of Riverside, and we served the Coachella area. At that time, I was assigned the case of the shooting of Chalino Sanchez in Coachella. I'd never heard of him before, had no idea who he was, but because of the large crowd that was gathered and the press following and the Spanish-speaking press thereafter, I knew that he must have been somewhat of a cult or popular musician in the Hispanic culture, of which there's many members in the Coachella Valley.
Anything of that?
Yeah, initially the case was not a headline news item, but it certainly was on the B section of the newspaper because of the Spanish-speaking culture in our local community having interest in Chalino Sanchez, the musician. Apparently he had a great following that we weren't aware of at the time in the prosecutor's office and were not particularly interested in. It was another murder case. But what's differentiated this murder case from other murder cases is that we were prosecuting the initial shooter, that is Eduardo Gallegos, for murder, for a killing that Chalino Sanchez had committed. The initial culprit, that is Eduardo, who jumped up on the stage and initiated the shooting, but under the provocative act murder doctrine, it was somewhat of a different kind of theory to proceed in a murder prosecution. At the time, there was some thought in the office that because it was different and unusual, that we should perhaps try to settle the case a little bit rather than push forward as if we had stronger evidence for a first-degree murder prosecution. Because I was intrigued by the nature of the case, because I had never seen a provocative act murder doctrine case prosecuted in my life or in my experience, I went forward with it and was successful in that prosecution. Was that Eduardo was just another member of the audience listening to Chalino Sanchez perform at a packed nightclub in Coachella, California, when Eduardo Gallegos jumped up on the stage, pulled out a handgun, and shot in the direction of Chalino Sanchez, actually wounding Chalino. Unexpected, of course, to anybody in, at least I would think, in the crowd or to anybody in my office or law enforcement, Chalino was packing his own weapon, pulled out his own large caliber handgun, and commenced shooting at Eduardo. Unintentionally, I'm sure, killed a member of the audience and wounded several others in the crowd by Chalino's shooting. Apparently, members of the audience, incensed that their idol Chalino was being assaulted, jumped up on the stage, grabbed Mr. Gallegos, and in fact wounded him with his own weapon. So what we had is a situation of great chaos and confusion and initial efforts to separate and to identify the circumstances were indeed somewhat complex and delayed. But once we got it sorted out, we were confident to proceed with the provocative act murder doctrine in prosecuting Mr. Gallegos for murder for the killing that Chalino had actually conducted. Okay, we have bloopers at the end of the Watsonville presentation.
Yeah, exactly.
Because I'll hang a moon, dude. I mean, if that's what we need.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, I was a homicide prosecutor, so I tried several murder cases, including a death penalty case not too long before this one. But this case was different in that we were proceeding to trial by jury without the testimony of the intended victim, Chalino Sanchez, who had been killed in Mexico several months following the shooting incident in Coachella. We were local. We were able to secure Chalino Sanchez for testimony at the preliminary hearing, which we didn't need to do under Proposition 115 in California. We don't need to have the victim present. But we had a suspicion that perhaps he was an intended target, and if it were to become the consequence later without him being there. We wanted to have his testimony at preliminary hearing. But for the most part, to answer your question, the local witness, Chalino Sanchez, did testify at the preliminary hearing. His testimony was recorded by a court reporter. He presented himself in a demure fashion, somewhat of a quiet individual. He didn't come across as a rock and roll type famous guitar player or singer in the culture that we had known him to be. But he was a gentleman. He did present himself very calmly for what he had been through. He testified in Spanish, and we of course had a Spanish-speaking interpreter to translate his testimony. He was very cooperative. He was very clear on the facts as they occurred, knew what had happened, had recollected and communicated that recollection very well. I thought that the circumstances under which this shooting was initiated by Eduardo were very suspicious. Initially, what we knew is that a member of the audience, of which Chalino was very popular and loved, a member of that audience had jumped up on the stage and without any apparent provocation had discharged a weapon and shot and wounded Chalino Sanchez. Going into it, we had no idea what a possible motive might be. It just was not there. Eduardo was not talking. There was no rumors to follow up on. All we had was the cold facts of an unprovoked, unexplained shooting of Chalino Sanchez. I thought that maybe the well ran deeper than what we saw. It became apparent to me that this was an intended killing. Whether it was sanctioned or not, we don't know. But I thought it was important that point that early on we preserved Chalino Sanchez's testimony under oath. When I first heard about Chalino Sanchez being killed in Mexico several months after the shooting in Coachella, I was surprised, but I wasn't surprised. I was disappointed, of course, but we always had a suspicion or an inkling that he was an intended target of whomever, and that ultimately, the circles he ran, this could be his ultimate demise. Yeah, preparation for trial of Eduardo Gallegos was a little bit different than what we normally do. I went to Mexico with a district attorney investigator in order to get proof of Mr. Sanchez's death so that we could use his preliminary hearing testimony at trial in front of the jury. Well, we were not met with warm reception in Mexico when we got there. All we wanted really was official documentation from the authorities that Mr. Sanchez had been killed, but they were very reluctant to cooperate with officials from the United States in the investigation of Eduardo Gallegos and of Chalino Sanchez. We were surprised and perplexed at the lack of cooperation. We were not warmly received. We knew we were being followed. In fact, my hotel room was broken into and my personal belongings were rummaged through. We had to prolong our stay from an expected 2 or 3 days to almost a week in order to battle the bureaucracy to get proof of Chalino Sanchez's death to present to the court in the United States for the prosecution against Eduardo Gallegos regarding the shooting. So it was very unusual. In order to get to the Mexican authorities, we had to go through the United States State Department in order to have introduction and point of contact with the Mexican authorities in Culiacan. Unfortunately, that fell through. The authorities did not recognize the transmission that we had of authority from the State Department authorizing our visit to their town, and in fact would not cooperate with us. I had a Spanish-speaking investigator with me who was very conversant with the authorities, and it was apparent that they were not going to cooperate. In fact, after close to a week, we were able to leave with a single document of the case involving the death of Chalino Sanchez, but they were very tight-lipped and would not open up their file, would not reveal their sources, would not discuss the facts and particulars of the case involving the death of Chalino Sanchez, other than to provide us with a certificate of death. This was my first experience dealing with Mexican authorities. Of course, in dealing with sister authorities in the United States, we are provided every professional assistance and respect, and then to get stonewalled by the Mexican authorities, our sister country, virtually within 100 miles of Coachella, was quite surprising. And back in the 90s, the cartel knowledge and information was not as developed and understood as well as it is today. So we didn't know that we were just walking into that kind of situation where the authorities seemed to be interested in making sure that we did not succeed with our mission. And my job is to explain to the jury why the primary witness to the trial of murder against Mr. Gallegos, why he's not present. And you could see that there was a look of puzzlement over their faces, and they're wondering, well, how are you going to do this? And the explanation, of course, is that we used the preliminary hearing testimony of Mr. Sanchez that was recorded by the court reporter at the time of the preliminary hearing. So the original court reporter was subpoenaed to court, came to court with the preliminary hearing transcript, and read maybe 2 to 3 hours of testimony from Mr. Sanchez's mouth, the now deceased Mr. Sanchez, to the jury. And her job is to do it without inflection or without emotion, but to be as objective and impartial as she can in her presentation. And it was somewhat moving and emotional testimony by Chalino anyway. So to neutralize that, perhaps remove some of what otherwise might be the courtroom drama involved in the prosecution of a murder trial, but the essential facts that were necessary to prove the circumstances, the events that occurred at Los Arcos and Coachella on that night were certainly articulated well and presented by Chalino at preliminary hearing transcript, and we had a very good reader of the court transcript from that testimony to effectively present that evidence that became at trial, of course without any cross-examination of Mr. Sanchez by the defense. So I was not as confident as I might have been in some other case. However, the jury did wrangle for perhaps a day or two in deliberation, as I recall, before they did return a verdict as we had requested to murder, and that is the killing committed by Chalino, but the shooting initiated by the defendant, Eduardo Gallegos. He was held accountable, held responsible, and sentenced to life in prison. The makeup of the community in the eastern desert of Riverside County is largely Hispanic, has been since the 20s and still is today. It originally formed as a migrant community for farm workers in the Coachella Valley, highly productive agricultural area, growing dates and lemons, grapefruits, orchards. There's a lot of those, grapes as well. But the community is a salt of the earth type of community, blue collar, hardworking Hispanics populate a large majority of that particular community. Since the trial in the Coachella Valley, while I was still there, Chalino's trial was highly followed by his loyal fans. I didn't know of his popularity before the trial, but certainly after the trial, I learned there's many people that contacted me and congratulated me from the community about respecting the honor and dignity of their fallen hero. And I appreciated the outpouring of support from the local community for this involvement. But you just got a real warm feeling from the folks that live there that this is somebody, Chalino Sanchez, that connected with them, that they felt a real strong bond and tie with. And it was not known to me before the trial, but after the trial, I may not have understood his music, but I certainly understood the strength and passion of their feeling for their beloved Chalino Sanchez. Back in the early 90s, we knew that we were met with a stonewall from the Mexican authorities. Despite the popularity of Chalino Sanchez, I mean, he was a big figure in the community, and one would think there would be every transparency in the investigation of his death in Culiacan, Mexico. But we were stonewalled, and there was obstruction that we were not, as officials of the government, not accustomed to. So it raised a question mark in our minds, but we weren't as familiar with the cartel and the industry that has developed in the 90s and 2000s since the death of Chalino Sanchez. So we did not at that time have a thorough understanding. But I think now that we have the advantage of looking back at the historical perspective, it's much easier to connect the dots and see that there was potentially and apparently some official involvement in the death of Chalino Sanchez, which caused their lack of cooperation with American officials investigating his death, and could be possibly an explanation for Chalino Sanchez's murder. Here I am 20 years later being asked about the death of Chalino Sanchez and the prosecution of Eduardo Gallegos. I had no idea at the time we tried the case that it would have this lifespan, this case, this interest, this involvement. Certainly to me it was a fascinating case because of the provocative act murder doctrine theory that the case was prosecuted under. Very unusual, piqued my interest as a prosecutor, but certainly had no idea of the fan following and the loyalty of the fan following throughout the decades would remain to the point of 20 years later I'm answering questions, I should say, about the death of Chalino Sanchez and the prosecution of his shooter.
Sí, por la primera